For years, fans of Bonanza believed they knew the man behind Hoss Cartwright, the gentle giant whose smile could light up a room and whose heart seemed too big for the frontier. But the truth about Dan Blocker is something far more complex. Because recently, one of his sons confirmed what fans had whispered about for decades, a revelation that completely rewrites the story we thought we knew about the man behind America's favorite cowboy. This wasn't just another Hollywood rumor, it was a secret that had followed Dan all the way from a dusty Texas grocery store, to the battlefields of Korea, to the glittering lights of Hollywood, and finally, to a quiet confession that changed everything. But before that truth came to light, we need to go back to the moment a 14-pound baby entered the world in rural Texas, and a legend was born. Texas Giant: Birth, Roots, and Early Oddities. When Bobby Dan Davis Blocker was born on December 10, 1928, in the tiny town of DeKalb, Texas, nurses gasped at the scale. 14 pounds of newborn, a record-breaking start for a man who seemed destined to live larger than life. From his first breath, people said he didn't just enter the world. He arrived. His parents owned a small grocery store in town, and that's where Dan spent most of his childhood, hauling sacks of grain, sweeping floors, and greeting customers with a grin that could melt the hardest day's work. The neighbors called him the Big Un, a nickname that fit long before he ever grew into his legendary frame. By age 10, he was already working beside grown men, hauling crates and lifting what most kids couldn't even budge. Strength came naturally to him, but what truly stood out was his heart. He'd carry bags for the elderly, lend a hand without being asked, and flash that quiet smile that made everyone feel lighter. At 12, Dan stood 6 feet tall and weighed 200 pounds. The local troublemakers tested him once or twice, and never again. Not because he fought back with fury, but because he didn't have to. His calm confidence said everything. He was the kind of kid you wanted on your side, the kind who made the room feel safe just by being there. Those small-town days taught him everything that mattered: hard work, humility, and decency. Lessons that would one day shape one of the most beloved characters on television. But back then, Dan wasn't dreaming of Hollywood lights. His future looked simple: football, maybe teaching, maybe the military. Acting? Not even on the radar. Until one small favor changed everything. He was asked to move a few stage props for a college play, and that single moment would ignite a passion that would take him from Texas dirt roads to television history. What started as a favor for a friend would soon turn a gentle giant into an unlikely star. But first, the world had a war waiting for him. From stagehand to soldier, college, acting spark, and Korea. College was supposed to shape Dan Blocker into a teacher, maybe a football coach, not an actor. But destiny often hides in ordinary moments. At Sul Ross State University, his size made him a campus legend. 6'4", 275 pounds, unstoppable on the football field. Coaches saw a future in sports. But one day, when the school's drama club needed someone strong enough to move heavy props, they called Dan. He agreed, thinking it would be just another favor. But when a fellow student missed rehearsal, he stepped in for a few lines. And that's when it happened. The laughter, the applause, the rhythm of the stage. It hit him like a bolt of lightning. For the first time, Dan felt something stronger than the thrill of a touchdown. He'd found his calling. Within weeks, he changed his major from English to theater, trading helmets for scripts and stadium cheers for the quiet rush of performance. But before he could chase that dream, the world called him to a different stage, one far more brutal. The Korean War was raging, and Dan, driven by duty, enlisted in the U.S. Army. In 1951, he was shipped off to the front lines as a combat infantry sergeant. The gentle giant from Texas was suddenly surrounded by chaos, freezing nights, relentless gunfire, and the constant shadow of danger. Yet even in the darkest moments, he stood out. During one brutal exchange, a fellow soldier went down under heavy fire. Without hesitation, Dan charged forward, dragging the man to safety through a storm of bullets. The act left him wounded, but it earned him a Purple Heart and the lifelong respect of his brothers in arms. When the war finally ended, Dan came home a changed man. He'd seen too much pain, too much loss. the experience carved something deep inside him, a belief that real strength wasn't about power, but compassion. He spoke out often against violence, against wars that took too many and gave too little. For a man built like a wall, he became a voice for peace. What he didn't know was that Hollywood was waiting, and that same mix of power and kindness would soon make him unforgettable. Returning home, Dan had no idea his next battle wouldn't be on the front lines, but on the road to fame. Hollywood's slow burn to Bonanza. Back from war, Dan wanted nothing more than peace, a steady job, a loving family, and maybe a classroom to teach in. He married his college sweetheart, Dolphia Parker, and together they built a quiet life full of warmth and laughter. He had no burning ambition for fame, but fate doesn't always ask for permission. While working toward his doctorate at UCLA, his unmistakable size and southern charm caught the attention of Hollywood casting agents. Westerns dominated television, and Dan looked like he'd walked straight off a frontier ranch, rugged, kind, and impossible to forget. Soon, he started landing small parts, one day on Gunsmoke, the next on Have Gun, Will Travel. Each appearance left an impression. He wasn't just another big man with a cowboy hat. He had presence. Even in a few lines, Dan's warmth shone through. Producers noticed. His natural timing, that quiet mix of humor and decency, stood out on screen. By 1959, a new project came along, a Western that would change everything. Bonanza. He was cast as Eric Hoss Cartwright, the middle son of the Cartwright family, the gentle giant with a heart as big as his frame. From the moment he appeared, audiences connected with him. Kids loved Hoss's honesty. Adults admired his loyalty. He wasn't perfect, but he was real, the kind of man who'd rather help a stranger than draw a gun. Behind the character, though, was the same heart that had carried wounded soldiers through war and groceries for neighbors back in Texas. Dan wasn't pretending to be kind. He was kind. That's why Hoss felt genuine. Off-screen, he bonded deeply with his co-stars, Lorne Greene and Michael Landon, the three forming a brotherhood that lasted until his final days. Dan even stood as best man at Landon's wedding, a testament to the loyalty he lived by. With Bonanza, he became one of the most beloved figures on television. But as his fame grew, something inside him began to shift. The man who once craved peace now found himself trapped in constant attention, and that quiet life he dreamed of was slipping further away. The gentle giant had found the spotlight, but it wouldn't take long before he started running from it. Private life, convictions, and contradictions. Fame never felt natural to Dan Blocker. While the world adored Hoss Cartwright, Dan wanted peace, not attention. At the peak of Bonanza, he was one of TV's biggest stars, yet couldn't take his family anywhere without being mobbed. So in 1970, he left Hollywood behind, moving his wife and 4 kids to the calm hills of Switzerland. Rumors spread, money issues, health concerns, even feuds with producers. But the truth was simpler. He just wanted a quiet life. "I'm tired of being famous," he once said. "I want to live a little while I'm living." Still, Dan never stopped standing for what was right. During a filming trip to the South, when a hotel refused service to black crew members, he told the cast, "If they don't stay, none of us stay." They left that night. No cameras, no headlines, just principle. Despite his good nature, the pressures of fame and his love of food began taking a toll. Between strict diets and long shoots, his health started to strain. But in Switzerland, surrounded by peace and family, he seemed happy again. Until one routine surgery changed everything. It was supposed to be simple, but it would become the moment that ended it all. A routine surgery's tragic turn. By the early 1970s, Dan Blocker had everything he'd ever wanted. A loving family, a peaceful home in Switzerland, and a career that had made him one of television's most beloved stars. But even gentle giants aren't invincible. Years of long shoots, stress, and his famous Texas-sized appetite had begun taking a toll on his health. In the spring of 1972, doctors diagnosed him with gallstones. It was a routine issue, something simple to fix. Surgery was scheduled to remove his gallbladder, a standard operation that carried little risk. Dan was calm, even joking with nurses on the way in. After all, he'd survived a war. What was a little surgery compared to that? At first, everything went exactly as planned. The procedure was successful, and Dan was expected to make a full recovery. His wife, Dolphia, and their children felt relief wash over them. Friends from Bonanza called to wish him well, certain he'd be back on his feet in no time. But fate had other plans. Just days later, Dan suffered a pulmonary embolism, a sudden blood clot that traveled to his lungs. It struck without warning. Within moments, the man who had once seemed indestructible was gone. He was only 43 years old. The news spread fast. Hollywood stood still. Fans who had watched Hoss Cartwright for over a decade couldn't believe it. How could someone so full of life, so strong and steady, be gone in an instant? Michael Landon, Dan's close friend and Bonanza co-star, later said, "When Dan died, part of the show died with him." And he was right. On set, the loss was impossible to ignore. The laughter, the energy, the heart that Dan brought to every scene, it all vanished overnight. But even as the cast mourned, a strange rumor began to circulate, one that seemed too odd to be true. A story about his size, his funeral, and the unusual way he was supposedly laid to rest. And that rumor would grow into one of Hollywood's most persistent myths. People said he was so large they buried him in a piano box. But was it true, or just another legend born from grief? The piano box myth, fact or legend? When news of Dan Blocker's death broke in May 1972, fans around the world mourned the loss of a man who had felt like family. Tributes flooded in. Newspapers called him the Heart of Bonanza, and letters from heartbroken viewers poured into NBC studios. But even as the grief settled, a strange story began to spread, one that sounded almost too unbelievable to be true. Whispers claimed that when Dan was laid to rest, his sheer size posed a problem. According to the rumor, no casket was big enough to hold him. The story went that his family had to use a piano box, the kind used to ship grand pianos, to bury him. It was shocking, absurd, and yet oddly fitting to the legend of Hoss Cartwright. The tale spread through fan circles, tabloids, and even talk shows, told as fact by those who swore they'd heard it from someone who was there. But the truth, it's far more ordinary and far more respectful. Dan Blocker was buried in a standard casket at Woodman Cemetery in DeKalb, Texas, the same small Texas town where his life began. The piano box rumor, as colorful as it was, had no basis in fact. It likely started as a joke about his size, told affectionately, that spiraled into a myth repeated so often it began to sound true. Still, fans clung to the story, maybe because it felt poetic, that a man who lived larger than life should rest in something equally grand, or maybe because people just couldn't accept how quietly his story ended. Even decades later, the myth refuses to die. New articles and YouTube videos still resurface the claim, some insisting there's hidden truth behind it. But every verifiable record, every official report, and every statement from those who were actually there confirm the same thing. The piano box story is pure legend, and yet, it says something about the man himself. Dan Blocker was so loved, so admired, that even in death, people wanted his story to be bigger than reality, because ordinary just didn't feel worthy of him. But years later, one of his sons would finally speak out, and what he revealed would change how fans remembered Dan Blocker forever. Dirk's revelations and the long shadow of fame. For decades, fans wondered what Dan Blocker was really like behind the scenes, the man behind Hoss Cartwright. The kindness they saw on screen couldn't possibly be just acting, could it? That question lingered until one of his sons, Dirk Blocker, finally spoke out. Now in his 60s, Dirk revealed a side of his father that few ever saw, not a Hollywood star, but a man torn between the joy of success and the weight of being everyone's hero. Growing up, Dirk remembered the constant attention, the cameras, the fans, the interruptions at every family dinner. While Dan handled it with grace, Dirk admitted that fame had quietly exhausted him. He wanted to make people happy, Dirk said, but sometimes I think it cost him his peace. After Dan's death, that peace became even harder to find. Dirk was just a teenager when he lost his father, and the shock left a scar that never truly healed. He later said the hardest part wasn't losing the celebrity everyone loved. It was losing the gentle, funny man who made every room feel safe. As Dirk grew older, he followed in his father's footsteps, becoming an actor himself, but on his own terms. He chose smaller roles, character parts, the kind of work that let him act without living in the glare of fame. "I didn't want to be a star," he once said. "I just wanted to work, quietly." In interviews, Dirk often spoke with pride and gratitude, but also with honesty. He confirmed that his father had always struggled with fame, that behind Hoss's cheerful smile was a man who sometimes felt trapped by his own success. And when asked about the myths, the piano box, the whispers, the rumors, Dirk didn't feed them. Instead, he focused on what mattered. "He was a good man," he said softly, "and that's the truth I want people to remember." Those few words cut deeper than any tabloid headline. They stripped away decades of speculation and brought the story back to its core. A man of kindness, humility, and quiet strength who gave everything he had to make others smile. Dirk's words didn't just end the rumors. They reminded the world why his father's legacy still feels alive, decades after he's gone. The real Hoss: myth, humanity, and legacy. Dan Blocker's story isn't just about fame or television or even tragedy. It's about a man who managed to stay gentle in a world that often rewards the opposite. He was a war hero who hated violence, a Hollywood star who didn't crave attention, a giant who used his strength not to intimidate, but to protect. Every role he played, every line he delivered came from something real, that deep compassion he carried since childhood. Fans loved Hoss because, in a way, he was Dan. The laughter, the loyalty, the kindness, it wasn't an act. It was him. And maybe that's why the myths never stopped. The piano box story, the endless rumors, the exaggerations. They all exist because people didn't want to let him go. Legends grow when hearts refuse to forget. His son Dirk said it best. His father's legacy wasn't about how he died or how he was buried. It was about how he lived. Today, more than 50 years later, reruns of Bonanza still play around the world. New generations who never knew Dan Blocker still laugh with Hoss, still feel that warmth that only he could bring. That's something no rumor, no tragedy can ever erase. Dan once said he hoped people would remember him as a man who tried to do the right thing. And they do. Because long after the lights fade and the camera stops rolling, kindness, real kindness, never dies. He was the gentle giant who made the world feel a little smaller, a little softer, and a lot more human.